Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this event hosted by the National Academy, Mathematics Introduction to the COVID-19 Era. I'm going to turn it over for a moment to my colleague, Amy from the National Academy to give appropriate welcome, and then we'll get right started. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. My name is Amy Berman, and I'm the Deputy Director of the National Academy of Education. And on behalf of the entire Academy, I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this forum. I want to particularly thank all of the panelists for all of their efforts in making this come to fruition, to the Spencer Foundation for funding this project, for our dedicated NAEd steering committee, and to the IT staff who is helping to make this all happen. Before I turn this back over to Bill, I just want to go over a couple of ground rules. All of the attendees are muted by default. This forum is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our website afterwards, as you saw when you were initially logging in. The attendees can leave questions in the Q&A box, and we encourage you to start this right from the beginning. You can also, during the Q&A session that will be at the end, you can raise your hand and you can ask your question verbally if you'd rather do it that way. You can also chat in the chat box if you would like, but if you have broader questions, we'd love for you to put them in the Q&A so we can capture them that way. And now I'm going to turn this over to Bill Tate, who's the Provost and Executive Vice President of Academic Affairs, the Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Family and Preventative Medicine at the University of South Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And I want to take a moment to introduce the panelists and also say what a great honor it is to serve in this capacity. I want to thank, first of all, my colleagues from the National Academy of Education, Gloria Latson-Billings, Michael Furrier of the George Washington University, he's the dean there, who really spearheaded this initiative and have done an outstanding job putting us in a position to have this conversation. I want to thank the panelists, and I'll start right in with introductions. We have two district and state level officials who have been working diligently in the area of mathematics education. Levi Patrick, who is Assistant Executive Director of Curriculum and Instruction for the Oklahoma State Department of Education, and Linda Ruiz Davenport, who's the Director of K-12 Mathematics for the Boston Public Schools. We also have two mathematics educators and researchers, scholars, both of whom have been very much involved with the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. Trena Wilkerson, who is a professor of mathematics education at Baylor University and currently serves as president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And Robert Q. Berry, who is the Samuel Brawley Gray Professor of Mathematics Education at the University of Virginia, and most recently, the past president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. Let me take just a moment to explain what our goals are. We want to take this time to identify the challenges and solutions to mathematics learning given the pandemic. Specific questions that will guide what we do include what inequities in mathematics have been exacerbated by the pandemic, what are the biggest challenges for addressing unfinished curricular learning in mathematics education, what strategies are you using, recommending, or discussing that might be the best bets for mathematics learning? If schools continue online learning, what are the best strategies for successful learning? We know that there are some likely inequities that have exacerbated student learning during the COVID pandemic. Those include uneven access to learning tools, high-speed internet, desirable study space, the need for certain types of family support that might be challenging in light of the family's various arrangements. We know opportunity gaps exist in that context. We also know that in-person learning is crucial for many students, and online learning has been difficult for many young people, depending on their demographic group, including English language learners and those whose home environments are not conducive for online learning and may not have the technology infrastructure to pull this off. We know that bandwidth has been a problem for many. During this pandemic, we've seen that students whose language may not be English as their primary language or their first language, it's been a difficult situation and compounded by online learning. We have to also take into consideration that there are just barriers to communication in this context that we find ourselves in. And then of course, the challenges for the students, the teachers and the staffs in different school settings. Just a bit of background on the history of this. The National Academy of Education convened a roundtable of over a dozen practitioners and researchers to better understand some of the principles that ground the problems and to draw relevant research for strategies. Today, our goal is to share some of those tips and insights that we've learned through those roundtables. And there's also a summary of that work that exists at the National Academy website. The structure of our event today is we'll have presenters, a time for discussion, and some Q&A. We'll start off with Patrick Levy, go to Linda Davenport, Trena Wilkerson, and then Robert Berry. Without further ado, I'm going to turn over the mic to Levi Patrick to offer his presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the introduction and welcome to everybody who's joining us today and watching in the future. My role in Oklahoma is recently the Assistant Deputy Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction, and one of the key questions that we're struggling to understand at a state level is the way in which state policies and the work that state governments can do to support districts and teachers and the educators and all of our families in being responsive to the many challenges that they're facing. So I want to do my very best to address the questions that the panel has been charged to consider, but I'll frame most of the work that we do from the way in which we're providing guidance to our districts, and perhaps that may give insight to you and to others about the way that we're thinking about this work. Next, please. One driving frame of reference for the work that we're doing has always been a beautiful quote from Rita Pearson that says, "Every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them, who understands the power of connection and insists that they become the best that they can possibly be." And we believe this work, and we are striving in many ways to rethink the role of a state agency in ensuring that every child does have that champion, and in fact that every teacher has the champion and every school leader has such a champion. And so I think we're trying to make this the priority in the conversation, is in what ways are we being an effective champion for our students and for our teachers. So I'll do my best to kind of capture a couple ideas that we have for two of these audiences in the current time. So next, please. So the first driving question related to this is what will we champion for students? Next. And that for us has been centered on an idea that an awful lot of attention is being given to learning loss, which we understand and appreciate and are also concerned about. But what may be of greater concern to us is the loss of the opportunity to experience ambitious teaching. And I bring this up to say, there is a time right now that we are being asked to do what seems impossible, to meet students in an environment, whether or not it be blended or fully virtual, or in some kind of block scheduling with A/B schedules or staggered models. The models are complex, they're difficult to get right. And what seems to be an easy option is to simplify instruction to a point where we are actually losing out on some of the things that we know make the biggest difference for our already marginalized and historically marginalized communities, and I think are important to especially get right in this school year. So the points that I provide here that we should champion for students are taken directly from the work of Alan Schoenfeld at the University of California at Berkeley in the TRUE framework. And we are trying to prioritize, and I think you'll hear this throughout today's conversation, that content must be grade level appropriate, and it must be cognitively demanding, and that there may be an emphasis on simplified instruction that may be more lecture-based, memorization-based, perhaps worksheet based, but very much the model of limiting instruction to a depth of knowledge one or a base level cognitive complexity, we think will further create gaps in the opportunity and access that students have to mathematics. And as we do this work, as we think about the way our instruction looks and feels in this time, we recognize that the work of the Teaching for Robust Understanding framework that focuses on these aspects of ambitious teaching highlights the need that all students and their voices should be heard and involved as students are making sense of the mathematics that they're provided access to. That we should do our very best, and especially now, to recognize that students need agency and ownership and to have their identities valued. And in a time when we know that they are going through their own personal challenges that perhaps we can't fully understand or appreciate, this has to be of a greater priority for us. And finally, that we have to double down on our emphasis of treating assessment as a way of understanding how students are thinking rather than what mistakes are they making. And the feature of formative assessment that is cast in the Teaching for Robust Understanding is about eliciting evidence of student thinking so that we can be responsive to it rather than simply to grade or evaluate whether or not students have mastered content. So we are trying to prioritize these issues and make sure that our teachers are thinking carefully about how they make these features present in their instruction. Next. And next one more, please. And so there are challenging things that we have to get right for our teachers as well. And as we are thinking about the work that teachers are having to face right now, it is quite unreasonable for each individual teacher to navigate their way through this work alone. And so there are some actions that we think that we all need to be taking to help stem burnout so that the great teachers that we have can remain in our classrooms and near to our students. So we want to remind our school leaders to consider opportunities for removing and eliminating extraneous aspects of curriculum. That is not to say to embrace power standards. We have a great concern that the idea that we can remove content through the use of power standards may actually further exacerbate the issues that Bill has raised and that others will talk about. So we cannot solve inequity by creating an equitable solution. And we do believe that we need to communicate more clearly and perhaps simply about instructional routines that can improve our Tier 1 instruction. And I'll make a quick aside here, if we could go to the next slide. In Oklahoma, we've provided a significant amount of guidance trying to help teachers to understand that the old gradual release model that is I do, we do, you do, can have value, but there are features of the learning experience, and perhaps now more than ever, that we should pay attention to, in that students have opportunities to grapple with the mathematics, to negotiate their understandings of mathematics with their peers, and on the next slide, to build consensus with each other about how different problems can be solved in different ways using thinking. And not always the thinking that is purely that's been demonstrated by the teacher. Next slide. And one more, please. So we are additionally focusing on staffing arrangements that we think can be creative, that would allow for teachers to, perhaps teachers who teach the same content or grade or subject, that they would be able to enter into co-teaching models so that not each teacher is responsible for overlapping instruction, but that they would leverage each other's expertise as partners, that we would do a better job of measuring what matters, which is particularly important at a state level. When we think of state measurement, we think of state assessment, and we are trying to help schools to understand that there is really a different opportunity now to measure things that do matter in our classrooms. And finally, to celebrate progress that we're making together. If we could go to the next slide, actually a few next slides. If you'll go to the first one with the graph, please. Thank you. So one point that I want to raise is that in a time when getting instruction right will be extra difficult, we have been working with our teachers in Oklahoma to think about asking our students different types of assessment questions that help us to understand if our teaching is in fact representative of the features of ambitious teaching. And we've designed a bunch of simple questions that are inspired by the work of MIST at Vanderbilt and others that we give to students on a every other week basis. And I want to just show you what that can look like. We've asked students if they have an opportunity to share their work in their math classroom this week. And you can see in a matter of just a few weeks of working with teachers, we were able to increase that from 63% to 82%. And on the next slide, just by reframing the way that instruction happens, we would ask students, what does it mean to be successful in math class? And you see shifts in thinking in just a matter of weeks where nearly half of all students said that the main goal was to correctly solve problems as the teacher had showed them, to an idea that the most important way to be successful is to learn from their peers. And so those ideas are fundamental shifts that we can actually measure, and we can measure what matters if we take time to do so and focus on the things that we know can overcome inequity. So if we could go to the very last couple slides here, Diane. Not only does every child need a champion, but every educator, every parent, every leader, every person needs a champion. And so we hope that that can reframe the conversation as we move forward here in Oklahoma and perhaps nationally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Levi. And now we're going to turn it over to Linda.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to sharing some of our work in the Boston Public Schools, where I've been a K-12 math director for the past 20 years. And as we go through some of my comments, you'll see some very direct links to what Bill and Levi have already shared with you. I'm hoping that as I talk about our work in the district, I'll be able to provide maybe some additional concrete examples of what this can look like to try to address the inequities in mathematics that we know that we're challenged by during this time of remote or cohort-oriented learning, where students are partially in school and partially remote. When I think about some of the conversations that are happening in the district, I hear a lot of talk about learning gaps. And I just want to start by saying that in our mathematics work in the district, we really try to talk about a term that's the term is introduced by Phil Darrow, who is one of the lead authors of the Common Core State Standards, and some work that the Council of Great City Schools has done around some of his work around this notion of unfinished learning, that instead of learning gaps, which implies deficits, unfinished learning is something that we can all, I think, resonate with. There's always more to learn, and for some students, perhaps there's a bit more even to learn. And so this frames the challenge, I think, a little bit differently. As for all the reasons that Bill has already identified, there are lots of challenges around reaching our most vulnerable students remotely, and particularly some of our students with disabilities and our second language learners. But as Levi was sharing, what we want to do is try to be sure that students continue to have access to what we call ambitious learning, because we do want students to really experience fully what it means to engage in authentic mathematical activity in ways that are standards aligned and prepare them for future mathematics courses and life. Next, please. I would say that one of our biggest challenges is fully engaging these most vulnerable students so they're eager to participate in mathematics learning. And while there's a lot to think about in terms of what's the nature of instruction, how engaging are the tasks, how much are students feeling like they're members of the community, I want to add just another facet of of this context. And that is, I think it's really important to be able to communicate to students that their ideas really matter. The work that they do in their small groups contributes to what everybody learns. What they shared during our whole group conversation contributes to what everybody learns. And so communicating to these vulnerable students that their presence matters because we all learn more when they're with us is also part of the message we want to convey, so that students understand it's for everybody's good that we have them there. We all learn from them. There can be a tendency in some schools to try to rush and fix all the learning gaps, and we try to slow that down and really frame all of the work in terms of unfinished learning and ambitious teaching. But one of our big challenges remains around how do we support teachers who are shifting into remote learning or partially remote learning around a new practice of ambitious teaching that now is even more complex than it used to be. And so some of the things that teachers need to know in order to address unfinished learning in meaningful and effective ways that are consistent with ambitious instruction have to do with knowing learning trajectories associated with the different content domains that they're teaching, being able to listen carefully to what students are saying and thinking, using models and representations that build understanding, and importantly, I think building on the earlier tasks from prior years so students can successfully use what they know to learn new content. So for instance, if you're a middle school teacher who's working on ratio and proportion, knowing that students a year before used making orange juice as a context for exploring ratios can remind students of that experience, exploring how we make orange juice to a variety of strengths to re-engage them in some of those ideas in a way that helps them be readier for the ideas that are at their grade level. Next, please. And so let me talk here a little bit more specifically about some of what we're doing. And a lot of that involves really preparing teachers to address the grade level, course level standards that are expected, while being prepared also to address any unfinished learning in the moment. And I know that this is really a challenge, and as I said earlier, it means that teachers need to know much more than just the content that they're teaching. With regard to an ambitious model of instruction, we're trying to continue to encourage our teachers to use what we call these low floor, high ceiling tasks with multiple solution paths that can engage all students. So regardless of the status of their learning, the extent to which some of it's unfinished, there are some ways that they can still engage in those tasks. And of course, that means having good curriculum materials in place that help teachers do that. Another piece of this work is providing teachers with access to the technology they need to provide the kind of instruction that we're encouraging. And in fact, this is a place where it feels like there's some opportunities, because with our collaboration with the Office of Instructional Technology in our district, we're actively supporting technology tools that allow for teachers to put rich tasks in front of them, monitor how students either individually or in small groups are working on those tasks, and organize their instruction around the different strategies and approaches that students are using. And so while we know that during remote instruction, there is likely a temptation to go back to more direct instruction, more of a gradual release model, the fact that the technology that we're making available to teachers supports the more ambitious model of instruction makes me think that, and I'm I have a reputation for being an optimist, but it makes me think that perhaps even teachers who were leaning in the direction of direct instruction might begin to shift their practice in the direction of ambitious instruction, because that's what the technology allows them to do. And we'll see if that really happens, but this is our hope. And of course, formative assessments are important, ones that build partnerships with students, making sure that teachers have opportunities to plan and reflect together, and communicating with administrators about expectations, and then building relationships with parents about what this all looks like. Next, please. I just want to show you our curriculum, one of our piece of our curriculum documents, where we lay out for teachers what did students learn or not learn possibly the year before. So where might the unfinished learning lie? And then some suggestions for connecting to that unfinished learning. Next, please. We also, in our curriculum documents, try to lay out what we mean by unfinished learning. And here I just have some highlights. We've actually elaborated on all of these much more deeply than you see here. And the other thing I want to add is that we've been working with math teacher leaders for several years now around ambitious instruction. And every building should have somebody in the school who understands what unfinished learning is about, what it looks like, how you plan for it. And those math teacher leaders will be a resource for teachers as they read this and wonder what it means for their instruction. Next, please. And so overall, what we need to be able to do, I think, to provide students with the kind of mathematics learning opportunities that we know are so essential is better support for teachers, better support for school administrators, and better support for families. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. We are going to turn it over to Trena and Robert now. Thank you.
Thank you. What Robert and I would like to share with you will resonate really well with things that Bill and Levi and Linda have already shared with you. And we really appreciate the opportunity from the National Academy to do this and to have this conversation in a time where everyone's making decisions about how to move forward and really offer high quality mathematics instruction for each and every student as we work together. One of the things that occurred for NCTM is we had to cancel in March 2020 our centennial conference that we were planning on having. And what we did is we took that and shifted it to 100 days of professional learning for teachers and others who were interested. What we have found, and we've actually offered it for free, I want to share with you that what we have found is that teachers are really hungry for professional development. They are looking for ways to build community that we're finding is so critical during this time. And they're looking for support during this COVID-19 and all these uncertainties. We've had hundreds and thousands to view the videos, but more importantly, the presenters have shared not only practices that they have been doing, but how these might transfer into the kind of environment that we may have today, be it one that is done only through technology, or if it's a hybrid, or if it's live in unusual circumstances, to be sure. But the idea is to really focus on effective practices. So you will see that we've all been shifting, changing, and adapting. The idea is to really support teachers. This is a key time to support teachers, not only in instruction, but opportunities to collaborate. Professional development, developing the collaboration and leadership has been critical. Social and emotional aspects we know are significant and need to be addressed as well. The idea is to continue to build and sustain a positive identity toward mathematics for teachers and students. And we want to engage in instruction that does that. And again, communication, as I've talked about, but not only with each other as far as classroom teachers, but also with families and the community. This is very critical at this time, and we're seeing more and more collaboration as we move through the past months that we've had. The last two bullets, I think, are really critical. We really need to ensure that we're increasing, not decreasing opportunities. In other words, we are offering opportunities for students to learn in ways that are effective. And also to address this through an asset base rather than a deficit lens. And remember that students are bringing experiences to the learning situation, and we need to build on these. And the idea is that we really need to work together on grade level content. We'll move to the next. So as I shared with you, we have the 100 days professional learning, but one of the things that I think is significant is the way they've been organized. They're free. People can access them now up until about mid-October. And one of the things you'll see that it is searchable, and I highlighted teaching practices because that's one of the things that really we are focusing on at this time is what are those effective practices that will help us in the situation that we're in. And as Linda shared, is that we hope will also continue with these effective practices in whatever circumstances they might be. Next. So it raises some questions about planning and preparing for teaching and learning. You know, how do you translate effective classroom teaching into online strategies? How do you use technology? There's so many different tools out there, but not only how to use them, but how to use them in a way that really promotes discourse. This has actually been a challenge for us to think about in an online situation or even in the environment where they're sitting 6 feet apart and trying to figure out how can you promote that classroom discussion. And that leads to being very strategic about physical arrangements of the learning environment and the instructional tools. And in a face-to-face, you know, creating working plans for how you're going to share tools so that they're safe and how are you going to use manipulatives and things like that, both in the synchronous, asynchronous, and face-to-face. How do you continue to do number talks and provide opportunities for discourse? And what professional development is needed for teachers to help support this? Next, please. And again, continuing thinking about, you know, in remote instruction, what are some alternatives to using manipulatives? Virtual manipulatives are certainly there. There are many websites that have those, but there are also a lot of objects that are in many homes, not all, but being aware of what's there. Or do you send packets home and how are you going to work with those? And schools are doing different things. And I say that because there is not one strategy for everyone that answers the questions that we're in right now, but instead there are ways in which we need to think about how we need to move into this situation to continue learning. We need to empower students as thinkers and doers of mathematics and not lose that, and really focus on instructional strategies that are effective for our students. And as already has been pointed out, we really need to attend to special populations. Young children, there's some particular challenges with them, but also children with disabilities and special learning needs, English learners, thinking about vocabulary and how they work in the environment that they might be in, and then home environments that may not have access to the materials that you're trying to use. Next, please. The other things that NCTM did is we realized there's still lots of questions. So what we've done is we've begun to think about, well, what are the key questions we need to be asking? Again, there's not one solution that works for everyone. So we had a back to school task force to put together a series of two things. One is their webinars that I have listed here that you can find on our website. But the other thing is there are actually documents for each of these groups for consideration of things for classroom teachers to think about, for families to think about, how to advocate for your child, building and school district administrators, and also other math leaders. And these offer various questions for you to think about. They offer opportunities for you to look at suggestions that others have had as well that might be beneficial in the work that you do. Next, please. So keeping in mind the decisions that we're making right now not only impact what's happening right now, but rather they're also going to have long-term implications that we need to consider. And in particular, we need to think about equity. This is one of the key things that we need to keep first and foremost so that each child has access to the kind of mathematics that they need in order to be successful. And so one of the other things that we've done is we've put together some back to school resources, as I mentioned, with the task force, but each week NCTM is putting together a group of resources that we think might be helpful as people not only are making decisions at this moment, but as we continue and having to maybe make changes and we're learning what's working and what's not working. Next, please. So again, just to reiterate, NCTM outlined in Principles to Action 8, high leverage, effective mathematics teaching practices. And we think these are critical during this time now. They may look a little bit differently in an online format or a hybrid format, whether it's synchronous, asynchronous, or within the classroom with distance being noted as well. But we still need to make sure that we have the mathematics goals that we need, that these are clear. We need to promote reasoning and problem solving through the tasks that we select, and Linda mentioned these earlier. We need to think about representations, and there are many, many ways of thinking about representation in an online environment as well as in a face-to-face situation. Again, supporting that mathematical discourse, and there are many tools that allow this. We just have to be creative in ways to do this. Really looking at the questions. We don't have a lot of time. It does take more time to do things in an online environment. That said, then we need to really think about the questions that we want to ask. What are the key questions? How do we move from not only knowing procedural, but understanding the concept behind it? That's going to be critical so that it can be built on. How do we support productive struggle? And our students struggle in different ways and for different reasons, but how can we support that in whatever environment that we're in? And then to continue, because of assessment, informative assessment in particular, is to really use student thinking. And how are we going to get this in an online environment as well as within the classroom with social distancing? All right. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Robert, and he's going to share a bit more about things that we're doing at this time that to address the current situation. Robert?
All right, so thank you so much, Trena. And some of the things that I will have to share will overlap with some of the things that have been said already, but I do want to kind of bring forward the document that NCTM and NCSM worked on earlier this year, moving forward math learning in the era of COVID-19. And what I want to highlight are three kind of structural things, or three kind of framing of this document: structures, teaching, and advocacy. Let's go to the next slide. And so I want to unpack each of these. So when we think about structures, we're really thinking about, some of the things that have already been mentioned. And so there are recommendations that are in this document as they relate to grouping. And in this case, thinking about how we might heterogeneously group classrooms and the students, thinking about differentiation, really that, as Levi mentioned earlier, tier 1 instruction, and then the kind of interventions that might go along to support using effective formative assessments. But what I want to highlight in this space is also this notion of how are teachers connected to one another, not only for professional learning to grow their skills and to collaborate, but also how they're connected around the collaboration of ideas, and also, to support, their emotional resiliency. The idea of, this is an emotional period of time. And so the idea of professional learning, but also the kind of the humanistic nature of the work that teachers are engaged in. Let's go to the next slide. And so the second structure in this document is around teaching, and all of the things that I mentioned earlier. But one of the recommendations that come forward from this is the idea to focus on essential learning. And so it may mean thinking about what are the essential things that students need to know and understand, and how does that, and how do those things connect vertically as one moves from grade to grade or course to course. And so kind of analogous to the curricular focal points that NCTM published years ago, but it's this idea, what are the kind of the big ideas? Again, use of formative assessments to support those essential learning. But I do want to also draw back on the idea of, teachers and the work that our teachers are doing. So our teachers allocated time to create, and plan for those structures. How are teachers supported around the 8 mathematical ideas? Because we're asking them to teach in ways, for many teachers, to teach using tools and technologies in ways that they have not yet previously have taught. And so it is, in some ways, this is a risk for many teachers. And how do we support them to take the risk while trying to incorporate those 8 mathematical teaching practices? Let's go to the next one. And the third thing that comes out of this document is the idea of advocacy. And advocacy is around the idea of supporting the capacity of teachers in the work that they do, but also thinking about issues of assessments, You know, will there be standardized testing at the state level for this academic year? I think there has to be some advocacy space in that, and there may be advocacy in that space. Are there, you know, are there the necessary technologies in place that teachers can be successful? Not only can teachers be successful, but also students and families can be successful. So how do we then humanize that space, then increase the transparency that supports teachers, students, and families in such a way that they, and we advocate for them in a way that they can feel supported in whatever ways that they're participating in teaching and learning at this moment. Let's go to the next one. And so the next series of documents are the Catalyzing Change documents. And NCTM in April came out with 2 new documents for Catalyzing Change. Catalyzing Change in Early Childhood Elementary, Catalyzing Change in Middle School, and in 2018 it published the Catalyzing Change in High School. Let's go to the next one, please. And so in Catalyzing Change, there were 4 recommendations, and I'm going to quickly unpack these recommendations as quick as I can. Here we go. Let's go to the next one. And so the first recommendation focuses on the broadening the purpose of learning mathematics. And this recommendation really focuses on some key ideas as it relates to, deep, supporting each child to have deep level of understanding mathematics. In the high school levels, it may be about, expanding professional opportunities, but we also want our students to understand and critique the world using mathematics. We also want them to experience the joy, wonder, and beauty of mathematics. So the question that we may ask is, in what ways can individuals in our schools, district communicate with educators, families, and children about broadening the purpose of school mathematics as it relates to shifts in learning? And so it is, when we think about, how do we help students experience joy, wonder, and beauty, whether they're in synchronous, asynchronous, or face-to-face as it relates to mathematics? And how do we then use the tools and technologies to help them understand and critique the world? Let's go to the next one. The second recommendation is around structures and the equitable structures. It's around identity and agency, but it really, these structures that advantage some students and disadvantage others. So we have to have a conversation about, heterogeneous grouping, but the issue of tracking that comes into play. When we say tracking that leads students to quantitatively different or dead-end course pathways. And so tracking that advantages some, disadvantages others. But in early childhood elementary, we may have to have a conversation about ability grouping and the idea of how ability grouping have an impact and may lead into tracking. And so those testing that happens in early childhood education that might put students on a path forward that might advantage some and disadvantage others. So what are the structures needed to dismantle or disrupt policies and practices and procedures that limit students' access to high quality mathematics teaching and learning? Let's go to the next one. And so this one is about, equitable mathematics instruction. I mentioned earlier identity and agency. So it is thinking about how do we support students to develop positive mathematical identity, and then, their agency is connected to doing mathematics, if they see themselves as doers of mathematics, what are the ways that they engage, how do doers of mathematics engage with in learning and teaching of mathematics? So that's about creating structures for teachers so that they can be successful in their classroom. So what partnerships should be fostered for educators, professional learning to strengthen their understanding of mathematics and equitable teaching practices? And the fourth recommendation, let's go to the next one, is about developing deep mathematical understanding. It is about some of these essential concepts. It is about the big ideas, as I mentioned earlier. So what supports are needed to ensure that students development of mathematical practices and processes within their daily mathematics instruction? So how does this show up daily? Not only learning content, but also the practices and processes that they use to engage in the content, which might mean that what are the supports that are there for them to engage in the content? And let's go to the next slide. And so finally, one of the things that all three books across the series make recommendations for actions. And so, what can teachers, schools, and districts do? While I don't have all of them listed, I just kind of highlight 4 things that can happen. We can analyze and evaluate systemic policies and practices and procedures that restrict students' access. And so thinking about, not only access to teachers, curriculum, and also access to, in some cases, tools like the internet. And also manipulatives. And so how do we think about policies that impact access? The second one is constantly implementing and linking research-informed instructional practices to equitable-based instructional practices. Again, the connection between identity and agency and teaching and learning, and how those connections deepen and understood. Assessment, how assessments align so that students can develop and understand deep mathematical processes, practices, and content. And then the fourth one here, providing teachers and math curriculum leaders time to collaborate. To me, that's essential. Teachers need time to not only plan, but also to unpack the ways in which they're going to deliver or engage and co-construct instruction and teaching.
That was an amazing set of presentations. I appreciate you all. And while you were talking, I was writing down a ton of questions. I know that those of you who are listening may have questions as well. So we're going to be keeping up with your questions. And the remainder of our time is going to be spent with a discussion with the panel internally and also taking questions. But I'm going to hop in with some common themes that I saw. Very quickly, there was a common theme around agency and identity. There was a common thing about learning trajectories. I heard ambitious teaching over and over again, assets and the like. So imagine if I've never heard of any of these terms before. For example, agency and identity. And now we find ourselves in the midst of a pandemic where people are teaching maybe online or maybe in very socially distant ways, things that are, everything's not the same. What do you mean by agency and identity? And what in the world does that have to do with learning mathematics? And why is it important at this particular time? I don't know who wants to jump in first. And I want to make one other quick comment, a caveat. Levi, you might have been the only one who didn't say it, but it was implicit when you talked about using other students' thinking as a part of what you were doing. Maybe I'm giving away the answer, but I'm curious as to what the rest of you think about it. And you can really quarrel with one another on this webinar about your language and vocabulary and definitions, but I think it's a big question for people listening. Who wants to jump in?
So Bill,
You go ahead, Linda.
I'll start. From the district perspective, the work that we lay out for ourselves in the coming year around remote instruction wouldn't at all be possible if we hadn't developed a pretty robust program of professional development for teachers prior to this time. And in particular, we've had time with math teacher leaders, one from every one of our buildings. And over the past several years, we've done a lot of work with Principles to Actions, the Taking Action books, the book around identity and access by Julia Aguirre and some of her colleagues. And most recently, the 5 Practices book, which suggests, I think, a very helpful model for planning for instruction. And these are folks who are in every building and can be resources to colleagues in that building. And so I think it's hard to embrace a lot of these ideas just now in the moment in this immediate emergency around remote instruction. But if the groundwork has been laid, then it's a little bit easier to try to move these ideas around to every classroom in every building in a district or perhaps a state or nationally.
So I would add to, so if I can be just very pragmatic in my thinking here, and I would say, if we think about the kinds of tasks students receive in their instruction. So let's just think about, if kids are receiving tasks that require them to answer 100 problems in 20 minutes or something of that sort, as opposed to a task that requires them to reason, process, think through, collaborate with one another, the task has an impact on how they see mathematics. And the way they engage the mathematics has an impact on their identity as it relates to how they perceive mathematics, and then their engagement around that is about their identity. So if mathematics is just a process of answering questions or solving problems, that's one way that they see mathematics. So they see themselves as doing mathematics as just answering questions. But if they engage in tasks that requires them to collaborate, to think, to explore, to answer questions about the questions that they're being asked to do, then math becomes about this connectedness, not only to the content, but to other people and to other resources. And so that's how they begin to see themselves as doers of mathematics. So the identity is highly connected to what we ask students to do and the way in which they engage in the mathematics. And so that's about agency as well. So what are they doing? It is all of those processes that they're doing and that relative engagement that is highly connected to the kinds of things that as teachers, we ask them to do.
So, Robert, is it all right if I add to that?
Everyone jump in as you see fit. Yes.
Thank you, Bill. One of the other things that struck me in the example that Robert shared, and that really shows how we want students to see themselves as doers of mathematics. But one of the things that strong sense of agency and identity, that positive identity lead to, is actual authority. So the students see themselves as the authority in the classroom, in the mathematics, in the learning. And it's not just about the teacher telling me how to do something, but instead they become authorities in the mathematics. And I think even particularly in the time now when we're trying to really promote discourse and collaboration, which is sometimes a challenge using it in the way that we have to right now, is this actually then, I think, supports students being able to engage with each other and not just with the teacher. So just like in a classroom situation where a teacher might have 20 or 30 students, the teacher's not going to be able to interact with every single individual student constantly, but instead you build an environment where they interact with each other. The question is how to support that in the kind of environment that we have now. And I think that what can happen, we have the opportunity to actually support the building of the agency and identity in a positive way so that the students see themselves as authorities in mathematics. So those thinkers and doers of mathematics.
Thank you. Levi, you ready to jump in?
I have shared some resources in the chat that link directly to the True Mathematics description about this, the conversation guide, and some of the guiding questions. So if people want to dig deeper into it, they could go right to, I think, one of the original, for me, one of the original sources of understanding this better. But how beautifully everybody here has shared all the wonderful ideas. And I want to build on one point that Trena made about authority. I have found it useful to relate authority to authorship, to appreciate the difference with authority as being somebody who's in charge to somebody who maybe is creating or generating new ideas. And I think where Trena was hitting the nail on the head is that there's a shift in authority. Is the teacher the one who is in charge and knows the math, or the students generating ideas? And as everybody else has said, are they engaged? Are they valued and discussed? So I do love authority, and I especially love it when framed as authorship. And when you can create a class that values the authorship of the students, that they contribute new mathematical thinking, it can be really powerful.
Thank you.
And Bill,
yes.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and add that access to good curriculum materials that support teachers in doing this kind of work, I think, is also really helpful. And increasingly, there are some open source materials that are available. There's some rich math routines that are available, and steering teachers in the directions of those resources can help make a transition to this kind of practice a little easier, because it's ambitious teaching for students, but it's also ambitious teaching for teachers And there's a lot to learn in order to be able to do it well.
So I think it was you, Linda, who mentioned a phrase, low floor, high ceiling tasks with multiple solution paths. That was in your presentation?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
You know, what is a low floor task with multiple pathways? I mean, you know, I really want to understand that more.
Well, I'll give an example. Maybe this is not quite to the point, but we have an example of a classroom where kindergarten students were working on division ideas. And so ordinarily you think, okay, division comes maybe in 3rd and 4th grade when kids are working on multiplication, but any division problem, especially with whole numbers, can be solved just by counting. And so if you take a task and maybe you're hoping that students will engage with it in particular ways using particular constructs and procedures, but perhaps there's some other ways to solve it as well. For instance, a guess and check, drawing a representation, something that makes the mathematics accessible. The important thing is really understanding what is this problem about and what question am I trying to answer? And once you have that in your mind, then there are lots of different approaches that I think students can use to solve a problem successfully. And what's also really important there is that after students work on that problem and look at the array of solution strategies that are used, you can begin to make connections to maybe more informal, a more intuitive approach to maybe a more analytical and algebraic approach. And so you can begin to see the connections across those different kinds of strategies.
Thank you for that. Anybody else want to talk about that? Because I have another question for you. And Amy, don't let me get off of our colleagues who are listening. If they have anything, you know, just let me know, and I'll bring it into play. But I'm curious. The term assets-based instruction was used in our conversation, and I really want to get a handle on that. If I'm teaching right now and I'm teaching in the context of the pandemic, what does an asset-based instruction look like in the context of what we're doing right now? Don't tell me I've stumped the group.
I'm certain that there will be brilliant ideas to be added to this, but I'll make one point. I think especially it's important as we think about what we tend to frame remediation around, or what students don't know. And we tend to make assumptions about them being blank slates in particular areas. So we don't kind of appreciate the learning progressions and the continuity of the mathematics sequence that has been worked so hard on in so many states through the development of the standards. So this isn't the only way that asset-based learning is thought of, but I think appreciating that students come to us with prior experiences, ways of thinking and interpreting mathematics that we can value, and that they have insight and all sorts of other things that they can add to the conversation that we can build upon, is important rather than assuming that the primary function of the teacher is to take students who are blank slates and write upon them the new mathematical ideas. So I think that's one of the things that we should pay attention to, are the ways that students demonstrate to us the various facets of understanding of content, and then leverage those to help them see themselves as part of a mathematical storyline, so they understand where they are in that story. They can see connections from the past mathematics into the future mathematics that we're working on.
Anybody else on asset-based?
I mean, I guess to add to what Levi said, I think he's captured, but I would add, when we think about asset-based, too often when we think about students working together, we think about, as Levi stated, what they don't know, or what's lacking in their background or their understanding, rather than thinking about what are the richness and the resources that students bring to the space. It humanizes them in a way that we see them as not only through their mathematical lens of their understanding, but all the other resources, background knowledge that they bring that we can leverage in our teaching and connecting students with each other around learning mathematics. So assets not only include, thinking about what students know and understand, but also the kind of the resources that they bring to the learning space as well.
And Bill, if I could add to that.
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that it just reminds me of, though, is that with this idea of asset-based and talking about the things that that means and what it entails, and how you work toward this, I think it also just really underscores the need for teachers to be able to collaborate. They need opportunities to have discussions among themselves, across grade levels, within grade levels, with others, across districts, et cetera. They need a learning community that will help them in trying to think about some of these big ideas. All right. And oftentimes with this, we do approach things through a deficit, and we don't even realize it. So being able to openly have conversations about that and to really acknowledge it, I think is really important, and to get help from each other. So that means you have to have a safe community in which to do that. So I think that's another important aspect.
Thank you. So there are questions in the chat box. One of the questions from a colleague I know very well, I'm going to give her an opportunity to be heard here, is are there assumptions by the panelists that students that work in groups and engage with meaningful tasks will also lead to issues of authority or power among who is seen as the expert in that group, et cetera? So as you start working out the whole agency identity piece, how do you deal with the various power structures within a group function?
I don't have an answer for this, but if I could make it more salient for us as we're thinking about this, we've just been reviewing some work in science education where some students, where we pay attention to how different students experience the very same learning experience in completely different ways. And one of those experiences became even more clear for me even as I've been trying to understand how authority is something that is unequal in a setting, where there were some students, some Black students, who basically were saying that they felt like they couldn't make their point because the way in which they would engage in that conversation may be seen by the white teacher as disruptive rather than constructive. And so even when being invited into a debate about negotiating mathematics, there are social norms that and beliefs that even for the very youngest children have shaped for them a perspective or belief about whether or not they're actually in fact welcomed. And I just want to put that out there because I certainly don't have the answers, but I'm only just now starting to more fully understand the challenges that we face. So I hope others will share new ideas about how we create safety and negotiate the power struggles that even happen in the smallest spaces, or even in the spaces that we try to make open and welcome.
Thank you.
So maybe I'll just share a couple of words about this idea of authority and identity and what students bring to the work, and how that plays out in small groups and also whole group settings. And I think it's a piece of work that's really important for teachers to take on in terms of recognizing and honoring the range of mathematical ideas that emerge in a classroom or in a small group, and helping students who may not see themselves as having power begin to learn that maybe they do have something to offer and some power in a conversation. One of the approaches that we've done some work with in the district is this idea of assigned competence that Joe Bowler talks about a lot, which is to take an idea that maybe emerges quietly as students work together, and to elevate it, recognize it, build on it, so that everyone in the classroom, everyone in the small groups sees that these contributions are important, even if they're coming from students that sometimes see themselves or might be seen as having less to offer. But it's really vital to the work we want to do in classrooms.
one other point about this is I think we have to keep in mind that it's not a one and done event. Like you don't just magically have this safe environment for everyone, that everyone's valued, that it builds over time, and that there are critical roles of the teacher, of families, of the school. So it has a lot of different impacts than just the environment in the classroom itself. Even in an online environment, which is another whole level to think about, is how do you create this kind of environment in a technology kind of thing, whether you're using Google Classroom or Zoom or whatever it is that you're using, so that everyone's thoughts and ideas are valued. And then how do you not only work toward creating this environment, but then how do you continue to support that environment? So I think it's an ongoing thing, that it's not something that just magically happens. And as Rochelle pointed out, just because you have this great task does not mean it's going to happen, all right? It takes much more than that. Much more than that. And I think it's something to be aware of, and that teachers need to give themselves the opportunity to learn about it if they're not acknowledging other students in their classrooms in the way they should. They need the opportunity to confront that and to think about it and to engage in ways and practices to develop better at facilitating that, so that their students are seen as growing a positive identity.
So Bill, can I? I'm going to ask a question and answer a question, if that's okay.
You do that in the webinar.
Because I'm grappling out loud a little bit about authority and power, because we've been talking about authority and power at the classroom level, but what about authority and power as it plays out with teachers and those decision makers who make decisions for teachers for what happens in classrooms? And so in some way that, you know, sometimes that authority is taken from teachers and the kinds of decisions they make for what happens in their classroom, the kinds of tools they use, the curriculum that they may take. And so just trying to understand that relationship between authority and power as it plays out there. Because as teachers begin to know and understand the resources that their students bring to their classroom, I think they need to have the flexibility to make some decisions about how to best meet their students around curricular issues and tasks and things of that sort. But however, when that authority is taken from them, you know, or that power, or their power dynamics at play, it has an impact. And so sometimes it doesn't lie with the teachers, it lies somewhere else beyond the teacher as it impacts students themselves.
Excellent. There's a question here that if I were teaching, I would probably ask the same. I'm going to pop it in from a colleague, and it's not framed as a question, sort of, but more a statement, but I think it's kind of a question, and that's the issue of assessment. Excuse me. Assessment is extremely difficult under normal circumstances for most. What about in the context of remote learning? What should we be thinking about in terms of assessment, and how do we determine the learning processes, and how do we assess that, as well as measure appropriate outcomes? So I think this is at another level, not just assessing, you know, student thinking at one time, but how do we assess the totality of the learning process, the processes? How do we get a handle on that, as well as, you know, ultimately what students think? I love when you get stumped.
I feel, again, like maybe I'm kicking off too often here, but I'll make a quick point and others can clean things up. So we have tried to, I mean, this is not a new question necessarily, it's just complicated with modes of delivery. I'll share in the chat momentarily, had produced a few years ago with one of the, if you remember, the Math and Science Partnership Grants, produced a series of formative assessment probes that were meant to demonstrate to teachers the power of eliciting student thinking and more fully understand the ways in which they're making sense of the mathematics. And those are publicly available, and we created actually a virtual course to help teachers learn how to use them and better use them to establish an understanding of how students are making sense of mathematics. And then we've been playing with converting those into a tool like Desmos that provides a teacher a way of taking large amounts of information from students, looking for patterns more easily, and things to that effect. So it's, again, we don't have all the right answers, but I think there's a wrong answer. And the wrong answer is assess students to death with state assessment styled questions. And I think that the trend has long been build assessments that are as complex or match state assessments, when the state assessments have rarely served as a useful model for that. So I think with any amount of flexibility that can be afforded to the teacher, they should recenter their focus on tools or probes, like I'll share, that just give better insight into student thinking when possible.
I think this is also a time where we really can give some really serious consideration of ways to formatively assess our students. Particularly if you are in an environment that is synchronous, that you're doing online instruction, you can't continue to do, if you've been doing it in the past, just giving paper pencil type tests, because that's not what's going to work in this kind of environment. And what I'm hoping is that during this time that we are having to really think about what the purpose of assessment is, how do you use assessment data in the short term of making instructional decisions, and as you pointed out, Bill, what about long-term thinking? You know, what learning gains are we making? I think this gives us an opportunity to really think about what are best practices in assessment, and then how do we use that data. One of the things that I hope is that I know that there's the big question now about whether there will be state assessments, and some states have already said no, and others are saying yes, and others are saying maybe. And I think one of the things that is difficult about giving those assessments is it takes away funding. It takes away time in instruction, which is extremely precious always, but particularly precious right now because it takes longer. Who knows when we all will have to go back online if you are doing some face-to-face, and there's so much social and emotional kind of things wrapped up in this. This is just not a good time to really be thinking about those kinds of assessments that we've done in the past. But instead, let's really think about what can we assess and how can we assess it so that it helps teachers to understand their students and what they're understanding.
Thank you.
I think
We're going to get some help from our IT folks to unmute a few people. One hand that's been up is Dr. Juliet Indubaza. If I mispronounced your name, please restate it. I apologize.
I've allowed to talk. Please unmute and you can speak. It seems they went away.
I see. Well, we gave them an opportunity. Are there other hands up, Amy, that I can't see?
There are not other hands up. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A. Would you like me to go over two of them that are linked together? One of them I think you've already talked about.
Yeah, you synthesized a few in as we privately chatted, so why don't you offer those? That'd be great.
Okay, so one of the questions was talking about the skills of teachers, and that there are math teachers who don't feel comfortable with math themselves, and how do we make sure our teachers are qualified to be teaching math? And I feel like the question that the questionnaire said sort of dovetailed on that is that that they raised that in remote learning, many students are more engaged in mathematics than otherwise. And one reason could be that their teacher's fear of mathematics, not uncommon in elementary classrooms, is partially filtered out of the picture. Perhaps there's a natural experiment here for teasing out the negative effects of elementary teacher selection.
So one of the things that this makes me think about is that we need to support teachers, and you mentioned elementary teachers in particular, in building their own mathematical identity and agency as well. There are some who've not been comfortable with mathematics, as the question was raised. And this is a time that we need to find ways to support teachers to help develop them into them seeing themselves as mathematical thinkers and doers. I think that we're in a situation where teachers are being asked to do, in some ways, more and many different things than they've had to do in the past. And as you noted, some teachers, some are not comfortable in teaching the mathematics. And I think this is an opportunity for us to think about how can we support them? How can we help them to develop in their own mathematical understanding of themselves so that they do this, see themselves in that space. So there's professional development that can be done at the district level, national levels, et cetera. And again, professional learning communities. I think this is going to be vital during this time.
I mean, I would agree with you on that, Trena, in the sense that too often we see this work as an individualistic endeavor. And this is where we have to build community to support one another. And you know, I mean, I don't make claims that I know how to teach all mathematics, but, you know, and so when I need to access things about my own mathematical understanding, I'm going to access the community from which I know that can help and support me. So one of the things that we may have to do is to build awareness around where teachers can find the spaces of support and make sure those spaces of support are ready to receive that teacher. And so it can be locally, it can be nationally, but it is, you know, how do we build the collective professionalism about mathematics, not only learning and understanding mathematics from a professional point of view, but also the processes to help support engage in mathematics.
I would.
I was just going to say, well, and maybe this just adds to it, and then you go ahead, Linda. Is one of our attendees just posted more of a statement, but saying, "I've never understood why math is not given the status as science to be taught by teachers specialized in math in elementary schools in this country. Having math teachers teaching math is common practice in many other countries around the world where students do well in PISA and TIMSS."
Well, that's certainly a good question that I'm not going to try to answer here or respond to here. But I did want to say that initially the question that raised this discussion was around elementary teachers. And I just want to suggest that secondary math teachers as well as elementary math teachers have what we might call unfinished learning themselves around mathematics. And I think this is, as Robert was saying, this is a place where teacher communities can really support each other. When I think about what it means to plan for instruction, setting some norms around the expectation that teachers sit down and do the math together themselves before they teach it can be a place where they begin to look at different solution paths, different avenues that go to wrong answers as well as right answers, questions that they can be prepared to ask students. And if teachers are committed to working together to plan for their instruction, I think really exciting things can happen. In fact, in Boston, one year we had a swim coach who was required to teach mathematics for a year because it was an empty position and she needed to fill it. And she turned out to be the best math teacher in the building because she made the commitment to work hard with other math teachers to really plan for what she was teaching. So it's work that can be done collaboratively and shared, and can make a really important difference to instruction.
If I could just add one more point, and just from a different perspective on this one, I think we've talked a lot about co-planning. I think we should be speaking a lot about co-teaching. I think there's probably never been as big of an opportunity for us to think more creatively about staffing assignments and the way that we structure school. I think as I'm spending a lot of my time concerned about the burnout of teachers in Oklahoma and nationwide, I think that if there is a school in which 2 or more teachers are teaching the same content to a group of students, then that school is not yet taking advantage of the technology that we have available to us. I think that you could design a model where you're rotating teachers through as a lead teacher on certain topics. That could be negotiated among the teachers who feel strong with certain mathematics and weaker. You could prioritize planning and delivery responsibilities, but while also making space for better tier 2 and 3 structures. And I don't think that that's a district-wide solution that makes a lot of sense. I think it's a school-based solution that makes sense. And for our very smallest schools where you often only have one teacher teaching a thing, or even worse, one teacher teaching 5 things at once in a secondary setting, I think those schools have some real work to do about thinking about how to create that opportunity. But it goes back to what everybody said. Firstly, they should have an opportunity to co-plan. I think secondly, and hopefully this will come up more, they have an opportunity to co-teach.
Levi, that in many respects is not far removed from the math specialist idea. You're one step away from a math specialist. Now yours includes collaboration, which makes this a little bit different, but you could then see how a school district could say, we're going to innovate as a result of the pandemic and put our best prepared individuals in front of the students over time. I'm just curious as your thoughts on that. I mean, it's going to, I feel like this is happening in higher education. I think this might even may happen in K-12, but thoughts?
Well, I would just ask everybody to check out the work that the Opportunity Culture folks have done. They're especially active, in my knowledge of them is that they're especially active in Arkansas. But there are a lot of people who are thinking exactly about using existing funds, funding that you have access to, reorganizing it so that you can devote that little, I mean, it doesn't have to be extreme, but that little extra support, funding support, to encourage people to get their specialist certification like we have in Oklahoma, or a full-blown master's degree. I think that will require new funding ideas, and Opportunity Culture is at least one group who is thinking about helping schools through that issue.
I think Linda wanted to jump in.
Maybe you read my body language, but the question of getting more resources into schools has always been a challenge in a district, at least in the districts that I've worked with. Part of the challenge, I think, is that district administrators in the central office will say, well, if math gets to have specialists, then science needs specialists, ELA needs specialists, social studies needs specialists, and we can't afford that, so we can't do that for anybody. I think in order to succeed, we maybe need to make a case for why mathematics, and perhaps it's not as urgent that the other academic areas need that support. But maybe they do. And so maybe it's just really a matter of redefining how districts deploy their resources. But we haven't had math coaches in the district for probably 15 years. And we were very successful when we had that support, and we have not been able to maintain those gains without that support.
So I think some of those comments get to some of the structural issues and considerations, excuse me, that now I think is a good time for us to really think about those. What kinds of structures are in place that really impede what we think are best practices, what we know will move us forward. And budgeting is, of course, one of those issues that goes along with it. But I'd also say, and this actually goes to a point that Rochelle's making, we're talking about, Rochelle has actually made in the chat box that, we're talking about, well, teachers need to collaborate and teachers need to do this, and even administrators need to do this. The question is, when are they going to do it? And this is something else structurally that I think that we need to think about, is when are we going to have the opportunities for teachers to collaborate, be it within the school or across schools, across districts, state, whatever it might be, so that it's not an extra add-on to their day. We're already asking teachers, particularly teachers who in our area, for example, that are having to simultaneously teach face-to-face while having some students Zoom in and having to figure out how to work with them, and then having some that don't have that access, but you have to figure out another way for them to have the learning experience. So we're asking teachers to do those things, which is a lot altogether, along with everything else that we're asking them to do, and not necessarily having structures in place that actually support it. So I think it's going back to the stakeholders, et cetera, it's bigger than the classroom teacher that was mentioned earlier. I think, Robert, you talked about this. It's not just about decisions classrooms teachers make. It's also district administrators. It's actually people at the state and national level as well. So what kind of funding is needed? What kind of structures are needed in place in order to support teachers in doing the kind of work that we are advocating for?
Well, if a school is right now spending Title I funding to support a pull-out teacher for remediation, or Title II funding to support bringing in an expensive speaker, then those schools right now probably have leftover money from last spring and from this year to right now reallocate. And I know title funds tend to be at a district level, but they are deployed at a school level often for pull-out teachers. And we actually know that some of these things that we're spending money on for decades aren't actually making the difference that they're meant to. So I think there's actually money in some of our schools that could just simply be repurposed to provide people the space and time that they need to get this work done. That's a stretch perhaps, but it is true in some cases.
Well, it is most appropriate that in our last 3 minutes, we start talking about the structural and financial issues related to mathematics education, especially in light of where we are. None of us can predict how long this biomedical challenge will be before us. However, I appreciate the fact that each one of you has offered us an opportunity to contemplate what we can do in mathematics education in the context of it. And in the last 2 minutes, I'd like to give each one of you maybe 15 seconds to give us something to think about as we depart here at 1:30. We'll start with Linda, Robert, Trena, Levi, and yeah.
Boy, this is a challenging question, Bill. But I guess I know today we've talked a lot about teachers and students, but we haven't said much about administrators. And I think all the ambitions we have for teachers in terms of their ambitious teaching and the kind of instruction that builds on student strengths, leverages their funds of knowledge from their lives outside the classroom, is difficult enough to do. But if you don't have the support of school administrators and district administrators, it becomes practically impossible, especially given the stress that districts are under around student performance and fears about students not being able to pass state assessments either this year if they take them or next year if it happens then. It can interrupt the goals that we're setting, the visions that we're discussing, if we don't have administrators on board.
Thank you. So Robert, 15 seconds.
All right, 15 seconds. So
Yes.
one thing I would add is I think this moment might give us an opportunity to really unpack what our priorities are. What our priorities are as it relates to the tension between formative and summative assessment and the idea of assessment as it exists previously. And also our priorities are about what are the essential things that students need to know and understand mathematically. This could cause a shift to really unpack and prioritize things as we move forward.
Thank you. Trena, 15 seconds.
So I'd like to add to this for us to think about where's the voice of the student in all of this, in the making of decisions. Where are they being heard? And to extend even further, families. What's the role of the family? How are they being brought into the conversation of thinking about teaching and learning mathematics? So I would encourage us to think about student voice in these decisions that we're making, and also thinking about families and how do we collaborate and communicate with families and bring them in to this idea of teaching and learning rich mathematics during this time of certainly uncertainty.
Thank you. And Levi?
Wow, you all always say the things I want to say. So then I'll make one point. I think now's a real chance for us to, as Robert said, rethink assessment, but also rethink the way that we hear our students. So to sum that up, last year we asked a whole bunch of students every other week whether or not their ideas mattered in class, whether or not they would be, if their peers or their teacher would notice that they were gone. We asked really basic questions to understand students' experience, and we found that we can change their experience just by the way that we greet them at the door or in the Zoom class or the way that we interact with them. I think there's a lot that we can do by asking better questions of our students. So I think we should, as Trena said, really value their voice and make that a priority in this challenging time.
Thank you. On behalf of the National Academy of Education, I want to thank all the panelists and all the participants today. It's very stimulating. Your thinking gives us great hope. And I look forward to watching from here in South Carolina the great work you do in the various municipalities and districts and universities you work in. So thank you very much.